Welcome, fellow keeper of Gotham's secrets, to a meditation on masks within masks, on the particular darkness that lives in a name kept carefully from the world. Tonight we trace every identity the Dark Knight has worn, not just the cowl and the cape, but the personas layered beneath and beyond them, the criminal he pretended to be, the playboy he performed for decades, the successors who carried his symbol when he could not. So settle in, let the cave's silence find you, and allow yourself to drift as we move through every face ever offered to a city that never knew which one was real. There is a question about Bruce Wayne that Gotham has never thought to ask, because the answer is too disturbing to arrive at casually, and too obvious to remain hidden from anyone who examines the evidence with sufficient patience. The question is not who Batman really is. That question has preoccupied criminals and journalists and law enforcement officials for the entirety of Batman's career, has motivated elaborate investigations and considerable violence and decades of speculation that has sometimes come very close to the truth and has always, ultimately, failed to reach it. The question that no one thinks to ask is different and simpler and far more unsettling in its implications. The question is which of his two identities is the real one. The answer, arrived at through careful examination of everything Bruce Wayne has done and said and chosen across the decades of his double life, is not the answer that common sense would predict. It is not the answer that the legend encourages, not the answer that the mythology of secret identities in general tends to produce when applied to the specific case of the man in the cave beneath Wayne Manor. The common understanding of such things places the genuine person at the foundation and the costumed identity above it, the ordinary human being going about an ordinary life, periodically setting that life aside to become something extraordinary for as long as necessity requires, before returning to the baseline of the real self. This understanding is wrong, in Bruce Wayne's case, in a way that matters. Batman is the truth, Bruce Wayne is the mask. This inversion is not simply a clever philosophical observation, a play on the conventional understanding of secret identities, designed to seem counterintuitive without necessarily being so. It is a practical description of what actually happened to the man who stood in his father's study on the night of the murder and made a vow that would consume every subsequent year of his life. The child who made that vow was Bruce Wayne. In the genuine sense, a person with a name and a history and a set of emotional attachments and preferences and ways of being in the world that were entirely his own, that had not been manufactured for external consumption, that expressed something real about who he was, beneath the wealth and the grief and the particular quality of silence that had settled over Wayne Manor in the weeks after the killings. That person began to disappear the moment the vow was made, retreating gradually before the advancing construction of something that had no room for the preferences and attachments and ways of being that ordinary personhood required. Batman, when he finally emerged from the cave, was not a disguise worn by Bruce Wayne. He was the thing that Bruce Wayne had spent years deliberately becoming, the destination of a process of self-transformation, so thorough and so complete that it left the original person behind as surely as anything that enters a chrysalis leaves behind everything it previously was. The creature that emerged had Bruce Wayne's memories and his name on a birth certificate and his face without the cowl. But the organizing principle of its existence, the thing that determined every choice and shaped every relationship and directed every resource and gave every day its purpose, was not anything that the child in the alley had possessed or anticipated or would have chosen. Bruce Wayne, accordingly, required construction. This is the fact about the dual identity that the legend has always obscured and that a careful reading of the available evidence makes impossible to ignore with any intellectual honesty. The playboy billionaire who attended Gotham's charity galas with beautiful companions on his arm, who made careless remarks at press events that suggested a man more concerned with his next vacation than with the management of his family's considerable business interests, who cultivated a public reputation for charming uselessness that his father and mother would have found baffling, and his grandfather would have found mortifying. This person was not the baseline from which Batman periodically departed. He was a character designed with the same attention to operational requirements that Batman brought to the design of every other tool in his arsenal, constructed to be precisely and specifically the thing that no one would ever seriously suspect of being Batman. The construction was deliberate, and it was detailed, and it was maintained with the discipline of a theatrical performance whose audience could never be allowed to understand they were watching theater. Bruce Wayne, the playboy, had to be convincing enough to deceive people who knew him well, which meant the character required consistent internal logic, recurring behavioral patterns, plausible emotional responses to the situations that his public life produced. He could not simply be vaguely frivolous and occasionally careless. Vague frivolity did not survive sustained scrutiny from the kind of intelligent, motivated observers that Batman's enemies included. He had to be frivolous in specific ways that accumulated over time into a portrait anyone observing him could use to predict his behavior, the way one learns to predict the behavior of a person one genuinely knows, rather than a performance one merely watches. He attended the right events and wore the right expressions, and said the kinds of things that a man of his background and apparent priorities would say. He dated with the careful shallowness of someone who understood that genuine romantic relationships created vulnerabilities that his operational security could not accommodate, maintaining each connection at exactly the depth required for cover purposes, without allowing it to develop into anything that might produce complications of the kind that genuine intimacy always eventually produces. He arrived late to board meetings and made remarks that suggested he found the proceedings of Wayne Enterprises somewhat less interesting than his plans for the coming weekend. Projecting the casual indifference to his own considerable power, that was the most convincing possible demonstration that the power was not being used for anything that needed to be hidden. Alfred Pennyworth had been, before his service with the Wayne family, a man of considerable theatrical knowledge, a fact about Alfred's background that is not incidental to his usefulness in the double life, and that the legend tends to treat as biographical color without sufficiently examining its operational implications. He understood character and performance with a sophistication that most people bring to their professional specialties, rather than to their avocations, the internal logic that made a character believable from outside, the specific details that distinguished a convincing performance from a merely adequate one, the way consistency across time was more important than any individual moment in sustaining an audience's continued belief in what they were watching. He applied this understanding to the maintenance of Bruce Wayne's public persona with the thoroughness he brought to everything, coaching the performance through years of the double life, with gentle observations and occasional direct suggestions about moments when the character was drifting in directions that might attract the wrong kind of attention from the wrong kind of people. The Wayne Foundation continued the charitable work that Thomas and Martha Wayne had established, and this continuation was not merely a cover function, not simply a way of maintaining the family name's philanthropic associations in order to preserve the surface of the Bruce Wayne identity. Bruce Wayne's genuine commitment to his parents' vision persisted beneath and alongside the performance, a thread of authentic motivation running through a life otherwise organized around the requirements of a war. The Foundation's work was real. The clinics it funded were real. The scholarships it awarded changed specific lives in specific ways that had nothing to do with operational security or the maintenance of a cover narrative. But the Wayne Foundation also served the double life by providing the most convincing possible explanation for why a man of Bruce Wayne's resources and public position would engage regularly with Gotham's most troubled communities. The explanation that he was simply continuing what his parents had started, that charitable work was inheritance rather than investigation. The specific cost of maintaining the Bruce Wayne performance across the decades that the double life required was a cost that did not announce itself in dramatic or visible ways, but accumulated with the patient persistence of damage that compounds over time without ever producing a single catastrophic moment that might force acknowledgement and reckoning. Every evening, spent at a gala, performing the playboy, was an evening not available for anything genuine, not for rest, not for the processing of the psychological weight that Batman's nightly work produced, not for the development of anything that might have resembled a private life in any meaningful sense. Every shallow connection, maintained at exactly the depth the cover required, was a genuine human relationship that could not be allowed to deepen. Another person kept at precisely the distance necessary for operational security, rather than permitted the closeness that mutual sustained investment might produce. The people who knew him longest in his public life, the charity board members who had worked alongside him for years, the business colleagues who attended the same events season after season, the social acquaintances who constituted the landscape of Bruce Wayne's visible existence, knew the character rather than the person. They had developed over years of observation, a detailed and in many ways affectionate understanding of someone who was not there in any meaningful sense. An understanding that was, in its own way, a kind of intimate knowledge, and in another way, nothing at all. They knew what Bruce Wayne would say at a dinner party and what he would wear to a benefit and which causes he was likely to support. None of this knowledge touched anything real. Alfred knew. He had always known because he had been present for the transition, had watched the genuine child become the constructed adult, who had maintained across the decades his own complicated relationship with both the performance and the performer, his love for Bruce Wayne encompassing both the character and the person, the character concealed, his service encompassing both the manor's theatrical surface and the cave's operational truth. The weight that Alfred carried in this knowledge was perhaps the heaviest weight in the entire architecture of the double life, because it was the weight of being the only witness to the whole thing, the only person who could see both sides simultaneously and understand completely what was real and what was theater. The cowl, when Bruce Wayne put it on, concealed his face. The persona he performed in boardrooms and ballrooms concealed something further in, something that the cowl's darkness was at least honest enough not to pretend was absent. And between these two forms of concealment, across the decades of their simultaneous maintenance, whatever might have been Bruce Wayne in a life that had gone differently was preserved in a condition of permanent performance, present enough to be glimpsed in unguarded moments, distant enough to never be fully reached, real enough to ache. The billionaire was always the harder role. Batman, at least, was true. There is a logistics problem at the heart of every double life that the romance of secret identities tends to obscure, because romance is not particularly interested in logistics and secret identities. As a concept derive most of their appeal from the dramatic rather than the administrative. The dramatic elements are obvious and well documented, the narrow escapes, the moments of near discovery, the psychological complexity of maintaining two selves simultaneously across years of sustained pressure. These are the elements that the legend preserves and repeats, because they carry the emotional weight that makes a story worth telling and retelling across decades of accumulated mythology. But the double life also required, at a level beneath the dramatic, an enormous and continuous and largely invisible administrative effort directed at the simple practical problem of keeping two incompatible realities from colliding in ways that would expose both of them. Batman could not simply exist in the cave while Bruce Wayne existed in the manor above, each proceeding independently, without reference to the other's requirements and schedule, and the specific demands that each identity placed on the single body they shared. They occupied the same hours. They required the same physical presence. Every night that Batman spent in Gotham's streets was a night that Bruce Wayne spent somewhere, and that somewhere had to be accounted for in ways that would survive the examination of anyone who might subsequently become curious about it. Alfred Pennyworth managed this problem with the thoroughness he brought to everything, and the managing of it consumed a substantial portion of his daily existence in ways that went entirely unacknowledged in the public record of Bruce Wayne's life, precisely because successful management of such problems leaves no visible trace. He maintained Bruce Wayne's social calendar with the attention of someone who understood that the calendar was not simply a record of commitments, but a component of an operational cover. That each entry represented both a genuine social obligation and a specific alibi whose structural integrity required verification from multiple independent sources. He made excuses for Bruce Wayne's absences with the practiced ease of long experience, drawing on a repertoire of explanations that had been refined over years of use until each one had the smooth, unresisting quality of something often said and never questioned. The Wayne Manor itself was the primary architecture of the double life, and understanding its physical layout is essential to understanding how the logistics of Bruce Wayne's existence were managed with sufficient thoroughness to survive decades of scrutiny without catastrophic failure. The manor's public rooms, the reception spaces, the dining rooms, the library and the study that Thomas Wayne had used for his correspondence and that had served as the site of Bruce's childhood vow were maintained in the condition of a family home whose occupant was present and engaged with. Its upkeep, surfaces attended to, and objects arranged in the manner of lived-in rather than merely curated spaces. Any visitor would find a house that felt inhabited, that bore the marks of daily use, that communicated the presence of a person living a life within its walls. The grandfather clock at the end of the study's east wall was the threshold between this inhabited surface and the truth beneath it. Its mechanism, modified to respond to a specific sequence rather than functioning as a conventional timepiece, concealed the passage that led downward into the cave systems beneath the manor's foundations, a transition so thoroughly integrated into the building's existing architecture that its existence was essentially invisible to anyone who did not already know to look for it. This threshold was the physical expression of the double life's essential structure, the ordinary concealing the extraordinary, the domestic surface functioning as the cover for the operational depth beneath it, the visible and the invisible sharing the same space, without the visible ever betraying the presence of the invisible to anyone who passed through without the knowledge to see it. The cave below was the genuine home, in the sense that the genuine life was conducted there. This had not been true initially in the early years of the double life, when Bruce Wayne's constructed persona was still relatively fresh, and the psychological weight of maintaining it had not yet accumulated into the years-long exhaustion that sustained performance eventually produces. The manor above had retained more of the quality of an actual place of residence, a space where the person who lived there spent time in ways that were not entirely subordinated to operational requirements. As the years passed and the double life deepened, and the cave's infrastructure expanded to accommodate the growing complexity of Batman's war, this balance shifted in ways that were gradual enough to go unremarked as they occurred, and significant enough to be clear in retrospect. The physical injuries that Batman sustained in the nightly conduct of his operations represented one of the most persistently difficult logistics problems of the entire enterprise, because they were visible and they required treatment, and they could not be explained to anyone outside the cave's confidence through any account that was simultaneously honest and consistent with Bruce Wayne's public identity. A billionaire playboy who appeared at charity events with healing lacerations and improperly set fractures would eventually attract the kind of concerned attention that might result in medical consultation with physicians who were not Alfred, and physicians who were not Alfred would ask questions that the double life could not accommodate. Alfred's medical training, genuine and extensive, a product of the military background that preceded his domestic service, addressed this problem as well as it could be addressed, which is to say, imperfectly but sufficiently, treating what could be treated in the cave and managing what could not be concealed, with explanations that were implausible enough to be slightly embarrassing and exactly embarrassing enough to discourage further inquiry. The Wayne Manor household staff had been reduced over the years of the double life to the minimum necessary to maintain the manor's public appearance without creating an audience for the cave's operations. Alfred functioned as the household's entire operational infrastructure: cook, cleaner, manager, physician, theatrical coach, and the single human being in the world who knew every room in both the building above and the space below. This reduction was not accidental but deliberate, a security measure implemented gradually enough that it did not register as the significant change it represented. Each departure from the staff, explained through the ordinary mechanisms of retirement and relocation, and the kind of quiet attrition that large households experience over years, without its necessarily signifying anything beyond the power. Ordinary movement of domestic employees through the stages of their working lives. The rotating awareness of others who knew the secret created its own ongoing logistics problem, distinct from but related to the problem of managing the public cover. Commissioner Gordon's long uncertain knowledge, his apparent decision across years of collaboration with Batman to maintain a studied incuriousness about the identity beneath the cowl, to look at the evidence and choose not to follow it to its conclusion, required management of a different kind than the management required by the complete unknowing of the general public. Gordon knew enough to be dangerous if he decided to know more, and the logistics of the double life had to accommodate this specific form of partial knowledge without resolving it in either direction, neither confirming the suspicion by offering information Gordon had not asked for, nor insulting his evident intelligence by performing the Bruce Wayne playboy character directly in his presence, with the kind of commitment the character required for general audiences. The allies who were told the secret outright: Dick Grayson, Jason Todd, Tim Drake, Barbara Gordon, and the others who had entered the cave and received its truth as a deliberate disclosure rather than a discovered fact, changed the logistics in different ways, adding both resources and vulnerabilities to an arrangement that had been designed around a single person's capacity for sustained secrecy. Each additional person who knew represented an additional point at which the secret could fail, an additional mind that might be compromised by Batman's enemies in ways that would provide them with information whose consequences would extend far beyond the individual whose capture or manipulation had produced it. Batman managed this problem through the same instinct toward control that characterized his management of every other risk his operations produced, keeping information compartmentalized where possible, ensuring that no single ally knew more than operational necessity required, trusting with the completeness of the secret only those whose proximity to the cave made trust unavoidable. The close calls were numerous across the decades of the double life, and each one illuminated a different structural vulnerability in an arrangement that was, despite its extraordinary sophistication, ultimately dependent on the cooperation of circumstances that could not always be controlled. There were moments when injuries sustained during Batman's operations were witnessed by people who should not have seen them. Moments when Bruce Wayne's absence from an event he had been seen to enter could not be accounted for by any explanation Alfred had prepared in advance. Moments when the specific quality of Batman's knowledge about something that had happened in Gotham's criminal underworld was precise enough that a sufficiently attentive observer might have traced it back to a source that should not have possessed it. Each close call was survived not simply through cleverness, though cleverness was consistently required, but through the application of a more uncomfortable strategy, the willingness to allow people to believe damaging things about Bruce Wayne rather than reveal anything true about Batman. When absence needed explanation, the explanation was sometimes that Bruce Wayne had been drinking somewhere he should not have been, or pursuing a romantic entanglement that reflected poorly on his character, or simply failing to attend to his obligations with the carelessness that his public persona made entirely plausible. The character that had been constructed to protect the secret could absorb these additions to its portrait without difficulty, because a character who had already established himself as charming and unreliable could always accommodate new evidence of charm and unreliability without producing surprise or suspicion in the people who observed it. The double life was sustained across decades, not because it was perfectly designed, no design applied to the complexity of a human life across that span of time, and that range of crisis could be perfect, but because the person maintaining it was willing to pay whatever price each new threat to it required. That price was sometimes operational, a sacrifice of tactical advantage to preserve the cover. It was sometimes relational, a connection damaged or a reputation diminished to protect the secret that the connection or the reputation was threatening. It was always, in the deepest sense, personal, the ongoing cost of a life organized around concealment rather than disclosure, around the management of what could be known rather than the freedom of being known completely. Alfred understood this cost more fully than anyone because he administered it daily in the thousand small decisions that the logistics of the double life required. He had chosen to administer it with complete commitment, and that choice was itself the most complete expression of his love for the person in whose service he had organized his own existence. Not the dramatic sacrifices that the cave occasionally demanded, but the sustained, unglamorous, daily work of keeping two incompatible realities from consuming each other. The manor stood above, and the cave waited below, and between them Alfred moved with the practiced ease of someone who had long since stopped noticing the strangeness of what he was sustaining. There was a man named Malone who existed in Gotham's criminal underworld before Batman ever thought to wear his face, and this fact matters more than it might initially appear, because it is the fact that distinguishes this particular identity from every other persona in Batman's considerable repertoire of constructed selves. Bruce Wayne was invented. The Batman of Zurinahr was installed. The various cover identities that Batman employed for individual operations, the disguises, the temporary personas assumed for the duration of a single investigation and discarded when the investigation concluded, were fabricated from whole cloth, created to serve a specific purpose, and designed with no expectation that they would outlast their utility. Malone was different. Malone was real, in the specific and limited sense that a small-time Gotham criminal of that name had actually lived and moved through the underworld's lower registers before his path crossed Batman's in a way that ended one man's story and began another's. The original Malone was a fence and a minor criminal operator, the kind of figure who populated the margins of Gotham's organized crime landscape in considerable numbers. Men who were not significant enough to attract serious law enforcement attention and not ambitious enough to rise into the hierarchies where serious law enforcement attention would eventually become inevitable. He was known in certain circles, trusted in the limited way that such figures are trusted within underworld economies, where trust is extended carefully and withdrawn immediately when the evidence for its withdrawal arrives. He had the pencil moustache that would become his most recognizable feature in Batman's subsequent inhabitation of his identity, and the habit of keeping an unlit match in the corner of his mouth that gave him his name, and a reputation for reliability in the specific transactions that his criminal specialty required. He died, and the details of his death were such that Batman was present at or immediately proximate to the circumstances that produced it, and Batman, understanding what the vacancy in the underworld's social fabric represented in operational terms, stepped into that vacancy before Gotham's criminal community had fully registered that it existed. The substitution was made possible by the limited nature of the original Malone's social footprint. He was known in certain circles, but not intimately known, recognized by face and manner in the bars and back rooms that constituted his professional territory, without being understood in depth by anyone who might have been positioned to detect the replacement. Batman studied what was available to study about the dead man, his manner of movement and speech, his professional history, his relationships within the underworld, the specific texture of his presence in the spaces he had inhabited and assembled from this study. A performance sufficiently convincing to occupy the vacancy without triggering the suspicion that a more prominent figure's replacement would inevitably have produced. The physical construction of the Malone identity required Batman to become someone who was visibly not Batman in ways that went beyond the simple removal of the cowl. Batman's physical presence, his bearing, his economy of movement, the specific quality of alert stillness that characterized him in any environment communicated something to anyone sufficiently observant. A signal of capability and controlled threat that was useful in certain contexts and catastrophically counterproductive in the criminal spaces where Matches Malone needed to operate without attracting attention. Matches moved differently, carried himself differently, inhabited his body with the loose, unhurried ease of someone who had never found it necessary to be perpetually prepared for violence, even while existing in environments where violence was always a possibility. The adjustment was subtle enough to be invisible to most observers and thorough enough to survive the scrutiny of people whose professional survival depended on their ability to read the human beings around them with accuracy. The pencil mustache was maintained across the years of the identity's use, with the consistency that genuine identification markers require not merely applied for individual operations, but sustained as a feature of the matches. Persona that could be called upon whenever the underworld spaces required penetration. The matchstick in the corner of the mouth was similarly maintained as a consistent behavioral signature, the kind of small, idiosyncratic habit that people remember and recognize and use as confirmation of identity in ways that more dramatic features sometimes fail to provide. These details were the visible architecture of a performance that operated at a level of specificity that most disguises did not reach. The accumulation of small consistencies that over time built into a portrait that the underworld's regular inhabitants could recognize and trust without being able to articulate precisely what it was they were recognizing. The criminal spaces that Matches Malone inhabited were the spaces that Bruce Wayne could not enter and Batman could not enter without destroying the intelligence value that made entry worthwhile. The bars in Gotham's less prosperous neighborhoods, where criminal networks conducted their informal business over drinks, where information about upcoming operations circulated among the people who would be involved in them, where the casual conversation of men who were not guarding their words produced the kind of operational intelligence that no amount of surveillance technology could reliably replicate. These spaces were Matches Malone's professional territory, and they were spaces where a figure of his established reputation could move and listen and occasionally participate in conversations without producing the silence and withdrawal that Batman's presence would have produced in the same rooms. The intelligence that Matches gathered in these spaces was qualitatively different from the intelligence that Batman's other methods produced, different in ways that made it irreplaceable despite the considerable risks that its collection required. Forensic analysis of crime scenes told Batman what had happened after the fact. Surveillance of known criminal locations told him what was happening in specific places at specific times. The intelligence that circulated in Gotham's criminal social spaces told him what was going to happen, and where, and who was going to be involved, and what they believed about the likelihood of interference, in ways that allowed for intervention before harm occurred rather than investigation after it had. The difference between these types of intelligence was not simply tactical, but moral. The difference between preventing suffering and documenting it. The psychological complexity of inhabiting Matches Malone convincingly enough to deceive actual criminals was a complexity that Batman never discussed in any terms that might be called honest self-examination, but that the pattern of the identity's use across decades of operation made impossible to fully ignore. Performing criminality required more than the adoption of criminal mannerisms and the memorization of criminal history. It required the adoption, even temporarily, of a criminal orientation toward the social world, a way of assessing situations and people and opportunities that was organized around different values than the values Batman's primary identity was built to serve. In Matches's world, the calculation of risk and benefit operated according to different parameters than it operated in Batman's world. and navigating Matches's world required performing those calculations in ways that were consistent with how a man of Matches's history and reputation would actually perform them. Batman was good at this, which was itself a fact worth examining for longer than comfort permitted. The ease with which he inhabited criminal spaces and criminal conversations, and the criminal social dynamics that governed the underworld's informal interactions, suggested a fluency that went beyond simple study and imitation. A genuine understanding of how those dynamics worked that could only have been developed through the kind of sustained and attentive engagement that his decades of operating against the criminal world had produced. He understood crime from the inside in ways that his official biography of relentless opposition to it did not quite explain, understanding it not as an external force to be resisted, but as a system with its own internal logic, its own social structures, its own forms of honor and loyalty and betrayal that were recognizable to anyone who had spent enough time in proximity to them. The moments when other heroes encountered Matches Malone without knowing who they were encountering produced some of the Identity's most instructive episodes, because they tested the performance against observers who were both more perceptive than ordinary criminals and less positioned to recognize the specific truth that the performance was concealing. A hero who encountered Matches in a criminal context was encountering someone who appeared to be exactly what Matches appeared to be, and the training that made heroes effective in their own right also made them more capable than most of reading deception and identifying performance. That Batman's performance survived these encounters was evidence of its quality, that such encounters were necessary at all, that the criminal spaces Matches operated in were sometimes the same spaces where heroes found themselves operating, was evidence of how thoroughly the criminal and the heroic had become intertwined in the particular ecology of Gotham's endless war. The dangers that Matches Malone's deployment regularly created extended beyond the immediate risks of an undercover identity being exposed in a criminal environment, which were themselves considerable. The identity created a persistent risk of a different kind, the risk of becoming too useful to maintain properly, of being deployed so frequently and in such varied contexts that the consistency required for its long-term credibility began to erode under the weight of accumulated use. Any underworld figure who moved through too many different criminal circles in too short a period, who appeared in contexts that were inconsistent with his established reputation and professional specialty, who knew too much about too many things to have acquired the knowledge through the ordinary channels of a minor criminal operator. Such a figure would eventually attract scrutiny from the kinds of people who survived in criminal environments by being very good at identifying inconsistencies in the stories people told about themselves. Batman managed this risk through the same methodical attention to operational detail that characterized his management of every other aspect of the double life, rationing Matches Malone's appearances carefully enough to preserve the internal consistency of the character's social footprint, while deploying the identity often enough to maintain the active relationships and current knowledge that made the identity valuable. The management was never perfect. The demands of specific operations sometimes required pushing Matches into contexts that stretched the plausible range of his established persona, but it was sufficiently careful to sustain the identity's usefulness across years of deployment without catastrophic failure. The philosophical question that Matches Malone raised, the question that the identity's existence made unavoidable, even if it was never directly asked, was the question of what performing a criminal identity did to the person performing it, whether the adoption of a criminal orientation toward the world left marks on the mind that adopted it even temporarily, whether the fluency with criminal thinking that convincing performance required was separable from something like criminal sympathy. This was a question that Batman did not ask himself in any form that might have required an honest answer, which was itself a form of answer. The distance between performing a value system and beginning to understand it from the inside was not infinite, and the Matches Malone identity had required Batman to traverse that distance repeatedly across decades of use. He traversed it. He returned each time from the criminal spaces where matches operated to the cave, where Batman's values were absolute and his methods were organized around the protection of the innocent and the containment of the guilty. The traversal was clean, or clean enough, or was managed with sufficient discipline that the question of its cleanness never became something that operational necessity required addressing. Matches Malone remained in the corner of Gotham's underworld, where he had always been a minor figure, a reliable fence, a man whose pencil, mustache, and perpetual matchstick made him recognizable in the bars, where information circulated freely among people who believed themselves among trusted company. He was not Batman. He was not Bruce Wayne. He was something that existed in the space between them, a third self maintained for the specific purpose of accessing the one part of Gotham that the other two selves could never reach. He was, in his own limited and particular way, the most honest of the three. He did not pretend to be a hero. He did not pretend to be a man of leisure and charm. He was simply a small-time criminal in a city full of them, listening carefully and saying little, with a match in the corner of his mouth and the patience of someone who had learned to wait for the information that eventually, in Gotham's criminal spaces, always found its way to the people paying attention. There are things that the Batman identity was designed to survive, and things it was not designed to survive. And the distinction between these two categories is not always apparent until the untested boundary is crossed and the consequences of crossing it become visible in ways that cannot be undone. Bane understood this with a strategic clarity that most of Batman's adversaries had never possessed, because most of Batman's adversaries approached him as a problem of capability, a man of extraordinary physical and intellectual resources who needed to be overcome through superior force or superior cunning or some combination of the two applied at the right moment with sufficient commitment. This approach had failed consistently across the decades of Batman's career, failed not because Batman was invincible in any absolute sense, but because his preparation for any given confrontation routinely exceeded his adversary's preparation for the same confrontation, because his knowledge of his own limits and their limits was more accurate than theirs, because he had spent years developing the specific advantages that would matter in the specific kinds of conflicts that Gotham produced. Opponents who approached Batman as a capability problem were approaching a problem they had already lost before the engagement began. Bane approached it as an endurance problem instead, and the difference was everything. The systematic liberation of Arkham Asylum's population was not an act of criminal solidarity or ideological commitment to the freedom of Gotham's most dangerous residents. It was logistics. It was the deliberate engineering of a period of sustained exhaustion, the creation of conditions under which Batman would be required to operate continuously and at maximum intensity across weeks of unrelenting crisis, without the recovery intervals that even the most exceptional human physiology required to maintain peak function. Each escaped inmate was not simply a threat to be contained, but a unit of exhaustion to be delivered to Batman's body, a demand on physical resources that were finite regardless of the will directing them, a withdrawal from a reserve that could not be replenished at the rate it was being depleted. Batman understood what was happening. This is important to establish, because the tragedy of what followed was not the tragedy of someone who walked into a trap in ignorance, but the tragedy of someone who saw the trap, understood its mechanism, and could not find an alternative to walking into it anyway, because the alternative was abandoning the people of Gotham to the consequences of Arkham's emptied cells. He recaptured escapee after escapee through weeks of operations that ground his body down in the methodical, accumulating way that sustained physical effort without adequate rest always eventually produces. Each night's work leaving him slightly less capable than the night before, each morning's recovery providing slightly less restoration than the morning before it. The graph of his decline was not dramatic, but it was consistent, and consistency across sufficient time produced the same endpoint that dramatic decline produced, only more slowly and with the additional cruelty of being fully visible to the person experiencing it. When Bane finally came to Wayne Manor came to the cave itself, the truth beneath the manor, demonstrating in that arrival the full scope of what he had learned about the man he intended to destroy. Bruce Wayne was not the Batman who had built the cave and established the protocols and spent decades developing the specific readiness that made him what he was. He was a depleted version of that person, someone whose physical resources had been systematically reduced to the point where the extraordinary became merely very good, where very good was not sufficient, where the gap between what he could do and what Bane could do had been manufactured with precision and was exactly as large as Bane had calculated it needed to be. Bane broke his back over one knee. The specific injury and its specific consequences, the spinal damage that left Bruce Wayne paralyzed, the complete interruption of the physical life upon which Batman's entire operational existence depended, were not incidental to what followed, but constitutive of it. The question that the injury forced was not simply who would protect Gotham during Bruce Wayne's recovery, a logistical question that could have been answered in various ways that did not involve permanently altering the identity itself. The question was deeper and more structurally significant: whether Batman as an institution could survive a Bruce Wayne who could not physically be Batman, and if it could survive, what that survival would require and what it would cost. Jean-Paul Valley was Bruce Wayne's answer to this question, and the answer revealed more about Bruce Wayne's state of mind during the weeks of his paralysis than it revealed about Jean-Paul Valley's suitability for the role he was assigned. Jean-Paul had come to Bruce Wayne's attention through a series of events that had exposed his background as an assassin trained by the Order of Saint Dumas, a secret society whose methods of creating operatives involved psychological conditioning so thorough and so deeply embedded that distinguishing its effects from the baseline personality of the person conditioned had become, for Jean-Paul, effectively impossible. He had been programmed, in the most clinical sense of that word, to be capable of extreme violence in service of the Order's objectives. The conditioning installed across his entire developmental history in ways that could not be simply removed by the decision to reject its premises. He had made that decision, had chosen to work alongside Batman rather than the Order, had attempted with genuine sincerity to align himself with values that the Order's training had not included among its priorities, but the conditioning remained beneath the choice, a substrate of installed capability and installed instinct that the overlay of conscious intention could modify but could not eliminate. Bruce Wayne looked at this person, at this history, at this specific combination of extraordinary trained capability and deeply compromised ethical foundation, and handed him the cowl. The reasoning that produced this decision was reasoning made by a man in pain, in a body that had betrayed him, facing the specific despair of someone who has organized their entire existence around a physical identity that has been physically destroyed. And the reasoning accordingly had qualities that clearer conditions might have produced differently. Jean-Paul was available. Jean-Paul was capable, in the narrow operational sense, that he could wear the costume and fight at a level that most of Gotham's criminals could not overcome. Jean-Paul had demonstrated sufficient commitment to the general project of opposing Gotham's criminal element that his deployment as Batman did not require the complete abandonment of the identity's ostensible purpose. These were the arguments that the situation made available, and Bruce Wayne, in his diminished condition, found them sufficient. They were not sufficient. The transformation of the Batman costume during Jean-Paul Valley's tenure as its occupant was the most visible and most legible expression of everything that was wrong with the substitution, because the changes Jean-Paul made were not arbitrary or cosmetic, but directly expressive of the values the altered costume was designed to serve. He added armor in ways that emphasized intimidation over mobility. He incorporated blades and projectile systems that reflected an orientation toward escalating force rather than the precise application of minimum necessary capability that Bruce Wayne's design philosophy had always embodied. The suit became heavier, more weaponized, more openly threatening, the physical expression of a philosophy that had begun to drift from the one the cave was built to serve, and the drift was visible to anyone looking at the suit from the outside, which meant it was visible to the criminals who encountered it, and to the allies who worked alongside it, and to the city whose relationship with Batman was being gradually redefined by what the suit and its wearer were demonstrating about what Batman was becoming. The escalating brutality of Jean-Paul's operations proceeded through stages that each seemed, in isolation, like responses to specific circumstances, rather than evidence of a pattern. He was more violent than Bruce had been, but the criminals he faced were genuinely dangerous, and his violence was deployed against people who had chosen to operate outside every constraint that protected them from violent response. He was less communicative with allies, but Batman had always maintained a certain operational distance from the people he worked alongside, and the increase in that distance could be interpreted as a matter of personal style rather than philosophical divergence. He was more willing to cause lasting harm in the pursuit of immediate objectives, but the objectives were real, and the harm was directed at people whose own willingness to cause harm was well documented. The pattern became impossible to interpret as anything other than what it was when Jean-Paul Valley allowed Abattoir to die. Abattoir was a killer whose death would have been mourned by very few people in Gotham, and whose continued existence was not something that any straightforward moral calculus would have identified as a pressing obligation. But Graham Etchison, who was Abattoir, had taken a prisoner whose location only Etchison knew, and the prisoner would die without intervention. And the intervention required Etchison's survival long enough to provide the location. And Jean-Paul Valley had allowed a situation to develop in which Etchison died without providing it. The prisoner, a man whose only connection to any of these events was the misfortune of having been captured by someone Jean-Paul Valley, had subsequently chosen not to save, died in captivity, because the Batman who was supposed to represent the absolute commitment to the protection of innocent life had made an operational decision that sacrificed that life to a different priority. This was the moment. Not because it was the worst thing Jean-Paul's Batman had done. By some measures it was not, but because it was the clearest, the least ambiguous, the one that admitted of no interpretation except the correct one. A person who was innocent had died because Batman had let it happen. This was not Batman. This was something wearing Batman's name and Batman's symbol, and doing things in Batman's name that the name had been created precisely to prevent. Bruce Wayne's recovery proceeded under conditions that reflected the specific urgency the situation had created. Lady Shiva's involvement in his rehabilitation was not a comfortable arrangement. Shiva was not a comfortable presence in any arrangement, but her capabilities in the precise area where Bruce Wayne's recovery required. Capabilities were not matched by anyone else available. She trained him back toward the physical function that Bane's assault had interrupted, and the training was characteristically unsparing, and the recovery was eventually sufficient to permit the confrontation that had been building since the moment Jean-Paul Valley had first put on the suit. The confrontation, when it came, was not primarily a physical contest, though it had physical dimensions. It was a demonstration Bruce Wayne showing Jean-Paul Valley that the person who had built the identity could reclaim it from the person who had borrowed it, that the cowl's original occupant retained a quality of preparation and capability that the borrowed version had not replicated and could not replicate, because what made Batman, Batman was not the suit and not the physical capability alone, but the decades of development that had produced both the specific formation of a specific person through specific losses and specific choices across specific years. Jean-Paul Valley had been given the tools. He had not been given the foundation beneath the tools, because the foundation could not be given, it could only be built, slowly and at great cost, across a life organized entirely around its construction. What the Nightfall arc revealed about the Batman identity was something that the identity's apparent transferability had always risked obscuring. The cowl was not equipment. It was the physical expression of a philosophy whose requirements extended far beyond the ability to wear it and fight effectively in it. Separated from that philosophy deployed in the hands of someone whose psychological foundation was organized around different values, whose training had produced different instincts, whose relationship to violence and its limits was fundamentally different from the relationship that Bruce Wayne's formation had produced. The cowl became something else, something that looked like Batman from a distance and failed to be Batman in every way that mattered. The innocent man who died in Abattoir's captivity was the proof of this failure, the specific human consequence of what happened when the tools of the identity were transferred without the values the identity was built to serve. Bruce Wayne returned to the cave and reclaimed the cowl with the knowledge that the identity he had built was more fragile than he had understood it to be, more dependent on the specific person who had constructed it, more vulnerable to the specific kind of failure that Jean-Paul Valley's tenure had produced. He wore the lesson forward into everything that followed. Whether he wore it with sufficient attention to its implications was a question that subsequent events would address in their own time and in their own ways. The question of who should become Batman when Bruce Wayne could not be Batman was a question that the identity's long history had already answered once, badly, in ways that left specific human consequences that could not be undone. Jean-Paul Valley's tenure had demonstrated with devastating clarity what happened when the cowl was given to someone whose psychological foundation was incompatible with the values the cowl was built to express. The lesson was specific, and it was permanent, and it was written in the death of a man whose name most of Gotham never knew. When Bruce Wayne apparently died during the crisis that rewrote the foundations of the world, the question arose again. And this time, the answer was different, and the difference matters in ways that the legend has not always been willing to fully examine, because examining it honestly requires acknowledging something about Dick Grayson's Batman that the mythology of Bruce Wayne's primacy tends to resist, that the successor's iteration of the identity was, in certain specific and important ways, better than the original. Dick Grayson had spent the better part of his adult life working to be someone other than Batman. This is not a criticism, but a description of something that required considerable courage and considerable self-awareness in a person whose entire formation had been conducted in proximity to the most psychologically consuming identity in Gotham's history. He had been taken in as a child, had been trained as Robin, had spent his formative years in the cave, learning to be Batman's partner in the specific way that the cave's methods produced partners effectively, capably, and at the cost of certain forms of normal development that the cave's demands and Bruce Wayne's psychological limitations made impossible to provide. He had eventually understood, with the clarity that sufficient distance from a formative influence sometimes provides, that becoming Nightwing was not a rejection of what the cave had given him, but a necessary insistence on what the cave had not given him, the space to develop an identity that was genuinely his own, rather than simply an extension of someone else's. Nightwing was that identity. It was hard-won and genuinely inhabited and organized around a relationship to the mission that was recognizably continuous with Batman's, while being distinct from it in ways that reflected who Dick Grayson actually was rather than who Bruce Wayne's methods had attempted to make him. He led with warmth where Bruce led with intimidation. He maintained genuine friendships where Bruce maintained operational relationships. He loved people in ways that were not permanently hedged by the calculation of vulnerability, which was perhaps the most significant departure from the model the cave had provided, and the most significant evidence of how thoroughly he had managed to construct something beyond it. Then Bruce Wayne was gone, and the vacuum his absence created in Gotham was not a vacuum that the city's other protectors could fill by simply doing more of what they were already doing. Dick's initial resistance to accepting the cowl was not performance or false modesty, but the genuine reluctance of someone who understood precisely what accepting it would mean, and had spent years carefully building an existence that was not organized around that meaning. He had left the cave to become himself. Returning to the cave in the role Bruce Wayne had occupied was not simply a change of costume, but a question about whether the self he had built outside the cave could survive inside it, whether the warmth, and the openness and the capacity for genuine human connection that distinguished him from his mentor could be maintained within an identity that had been constructed around their systematic suppression. He accepted the cowl because the alternative was worse. Not worse in the abstract, but worse in the specific. If Dick Grayson did not become Batman, someone else would, and the field of candidates for that someone else did not offer comfort. The city needed protecting. The symbol needed inhabiting. The choice between accepting a burden he had worked to avoid and leaving a vacuum that would be filled by something less capable of filling it well was not really a choice at all, which was perhaps the most Batman-like thing about the decision Dick Grayson made. Bruce Wayne had never had a genuine choice either. The city had required what it required, and the person capable of providing it had been available, and availability in the face of requirement was its own form of obligation. What Dick Grayson brought to the Batman identity was everything the identity had always theoretically been organized around and had, in Bruce Wayne's hands, often struggled to actually achieve. He was genuinely protective, rather than strategically protective. His concern for the people his operations affected was not a calculated component of an effective public persona, but a real orientation that preceded calculation, persisted after it. He communicated with allies rather than managing them, shared information rather than rationing it, trusted people with the truth of his thinking rather than offering them only the conclusions his thinking had reached. He was, in the most straightforward possible sense, a better partner than Bruce Wayne had ever been, and this quality transformed the operational dynamics of Batman's relationships with Gotham's other defenders in ways that had immediate and visible practical benefits. His relationship with Damian Wayne as Robin was the most complete expression of everything that distinguished Dick's Batman from Bruce's. Damian had been raised by Talia al Ghul and trained by the League of Shadows, his entire developmental history organized around the production of an assassin whose psychological formation was as far from what healthy childhood development was supposed to produce as it was possible to get while remaining technically human. He was violent and arrogant and contemptuous of almost everyone he encountered, possessing extraordinary capability and essentially no framework for directing that capability toward anything that could be called genuine heroism rather than simply superior violence applied to the correct targets. Bruce Wayne, who was Damian's biological father, had responded to his son's arrival in his life with the characteristic combination of fierce protectiveness and emotional distance that had defined every relationship the cave had allowed him to maintain. He had taken Damian in and trained him and extended toward him the specific form of care that his formation had left him capable of extending, which was the care of preparation, ensuring that Damian had the skills and the knowledge required to survive in the world, without quite managing the deeper engagement that a child whose psychological formation had been so thoroughly damaged might have most needed. Dick Grayson became Damian's Batman while being, simultaneously, something more like what Damian's situation actually required. He met Damian's contempt and his violence and his absolute certainty that the world was organized around hierarchies of capability that he was positioned near the top of, with patience and warmth and the specific quality of consistent, positive regard that is perhaps the most powerful developmental intervention available to anyone working with a young person whose history has given them every reason to trust nothing and no one. He pushed back against Damian's worst impulses without withdrawing the regard that made the pushing back legible as something other than rejection. He established expectations without conditioning acceptance on their fulfillment. The partnership that developed between Dick's Batman and Damian's Robin was not the partnership that Bruce Wayne had maintained with any of his Robins. Not because it was better managed or more strategically effective in purely operational terms. It may have been less so, but because it was organized around a different priority. Bruce Wayne's partnerships with his Robins had been organized primarily around operational effectiveness, the development of capable partners for a war that required them, with genuine care for the partners present but not quite primary. Dick Grayson's partnership with Damien was organized primarily around Damien, around the specific challenge of helping a child whose formation had been catastrophic develop towards something better, with the operational partnership a consequence of that development rather than its purpose. Damien became, under Dick's Batman, measurably different from what he had been, not transformed, not healed in any complete sense, not freed from the formation that the League of Shadows had imposed on his developing self, but changed incrementally and genuinely in the direction of something that the word heroic could eventually be applied to without irony. This was Dick Grayson's particular achievement as Batman, and it was an achievement that Bruce Wayne's methods, applied to the same situation, would not have produced in the same way. The Bruce Wayne-shaped hole at the center of Dick's iteration of the identity was real, and it was felt, not primarily by Dick himself, but by the city and by the people who had known Bruce's Batman long enough to be attuned to the specific quality of its presence. Bruce's Batman had a weight to it, not simply physical, though the physical was part of it, but psychological, the weight of the specific obsession that had built the identity and sustained it across decades of operation. It was the weight of something that could not stop, that would not stop, that had organized its entire existence around not stopping, because stopping would require confronting what the mission had been, protecting the person conducting it from confronting since the night it began. Dick's Batman did not have that weight, and the absence was both a relief and a lack. It was a relief because the specific grimness that Bruce's presence produced in every room and in every interaction was genuinely exhausting to those who were regularly exposed to it. A constant reminder that the protection of Gotham was being conducted by someone whose relationship to the work was not entirely healthy, even by the generous standards that superheroism's demands required. It was a lack because that grimness was also, paradoxically, a form of reassurance, the demonstration that the person responsible for your safety was the kind of person who took that responsibility more seriously than they took anything else, including their own well-being, which was unsettling and, also, in a city as dangerous as Gotham, genuinely comforting. Bruce Wayne eventually returned, as Bruce Wayne eventually always returned, and the question of what to do with the cowl was addressed in ways that reflected the specific complexity of the situation, rather than resolving it cleanly in either direction. Dick remained as Batman in certain contexts, while Bruce operated in others. The identity distributed between them in an arrangement that acknowledged both the legitimacy of Dick's claim to it, earned through the period of Bruce's absence, demonstrated through the quality of what he had done with it, and the original occupant's prior relationship to it that no amount of legitimate earning could entirely displace. The arrangement eventually resolved into Dick returning to Nightwing and Bruce returning to Batman, the natural order of the cave's hierarchy reasserting itself in the manner that natural orders tend to reassert themselves when the circumstances that temporarily disrupted them are removed. Dick accepted this resolution with the equanimity of someone who had done what needed to be done and could release it when releasing it was appropriate, which was itself a demonstration of the psychological health that distinguished him from Bruce, the ability to hold something important without being held by it, to carry the weight without being defined by the carrying. What Dick Grayson's Batman demonstrated that Jean-Paul Valley's had not was that the identity could be successfully inhabited by someone with a fundamentally different psychology than the psychology that had created it, that the values the identity was built to serve could be expressed through warmth as well as through grimness, through genuine partnership as well as through controlled distance, through the cultivation of human connection rather than its systematic suppression. It demonstrated that the specific formation that had produced Bruce Wayne's Batman, the alley, the vow, the cave, the decades of deliberate self-abnegation in service of an absolute commitment was sufficient to produce the identity, but was not necessary to inhabit it. This was a more hopeful conclusion than Jean-Paul Valley's tenure had supported, and a more honest one. The identity was not simply the expression of one man's specific wound. It was something that could be carried by someone who had not been broken in exactly that way, who had been broken in different ways and had healed differently and brought different strengths and different limitations to the same essential project. The cowl, when Dick Grayson wore it, was still recognizably the same cowl. The city it protected was still recognizably the same city, but the darkness inside it was different, and the difference, for as long as it lasted, was worth something that the legend's insistence on Bruce Wayne's irreplaceability has always been somewhat reluctant to fully acknowledge. There is a particular form of preparation that belongs exclusively to people who have thought seriously enough about their own destruction to move past the denial that such thinking initially produces and arrive at the practical question, on the other side of it, not whether destruction is possible, but what, if anything, can be done to ensure that something survives it. Bruce Wayne had thought about his own destruction with the thoroughness he brought to every other operational problem his existence produced, which meant he had thought about it more carefully and more completely than almost anyone else alive had thought about the same subject applied to themselves. He had catalogued the methods his enemies might employ. He had assessed their likelihood and their potential effectiveness. He had designed contingencies for the physical threats, the injuries, the captivities, the scenarios in which his body was compromised in ways that required protocols to address. He had designed contingencies for the operational threats, the exposure of the secret identity, the destruction of the cave's infrastructure, the elimination of the resources that funded the war. He had also, eventually, thought about the psychological threats, and the psychological threat that he eventually concluded was most dangerous, most specific to his particular situation, most likely to succeed, if an adversary sufficiently understood his formation and was sufficiently committed to exploiting that understanding, was the threat of being destroyed not from the outside, but from the inside, of having the architecture of his own mind turned against him by someone who knew precisely which structural elements, removed with precision, would cause the entire construction to collapse. The backup he installed to survive this specific threat was the Batman of Zurinahr. The name came from a place that existed in the stranger registers of his own history, a Silver Age memory of an alien world where a human being had found that the removal from Earth-specific conditions had amplified rather than diminished his capabilities, where the ordinary constraints on human performance had simply ceased to apply because the environment that had produced those constraints was absent. Bruce Wayne had encountered this story and had kept it somewhere in the architecture of his memory, with the instinct of someone who recognized in it a useful principle, even before the specific application became apparent, the idea that what seemed like a fixed limit might be revealed as a contextual one, that the self one was in ordinary circumstances might not be the only self available, that a different environment might produce a different person with different capabilities and different vulnerabilities. He folded the name inward and installed it as the designation for the version of himself that would emerge if the ordinary self was destroyed. The backup personality was not simply a simplified or stripped-down version of Batman. It was something more specific and more carefully designed than that description suggests, a version of the identity that had been deliberately constructed to function without the Bruce Wayne overlay that normally served as the primary organizing layer of the dual identities architecture. Bruce Wayne, in the deepest psychological sense, was the foundation on which Batman rested the history and the grief and the specific formation that had produced the vow and sustained it across decades of costly operation. Remove the foundation, compromise the architecture at its base, and the structure above it would be vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with physical capability or tactical knowledge. The Zurinahr personality was designed to function without the foundation. It was Batman, stripped of Bruce Wayne entirely, not the performance of Bruce Wayne, the constructed playboy persona, but the deeper Bruce Wayne, the actual person whose loss and love and accumulated identity provided the psychological substrate on which everything else was built. What remained when that substrate was removed was not a lesser version of the identity, but a different one, organized around the same mission and the same values, but unanchored to the personal history that gave those values their specific weight and their specific vulnerabilities. This made the Zurinahr personality simultaneously more capable and more dangerous than the ordinary Batman in specific ways that the design of the backup accepted as necessary costs. Without the Bruce Wayne anchor, without the memories of the alley and the vow, and the people whose welfare had come to matter across decades of operation, the backup was not distracted by personal stakes in ways that the primary identity sometimes was. It could make certain decisions with a cleanness and a speed that the primary identity's emotional investments sometimes complicated. It had no relationships to protect, no specific losses to avoid, no history of connection to the people around it that might influence its operational calculus in ways that pure mission focus would have eliminated. But without the Bruce Wayne anchor, it was also not moderated by the specific human qualities that Bruce Wayne's continued presence in the identity provided, however buried and however consistently subordinated to operational requirements. The compassion that remained in Batman despite everything, the grief that was the original engine of the mission and that expressed itself beneath all the armor and all the distance, as a genuine and sustained investment in the protection of innocent people, was a function of Bruce Wayne's continued presence in the identity, and the backup personality operated without it. The Batman of Zurinahr was not cruel, but he was not warm in even the residual way that Bruce Wayne's Batman managed to be warm despite everything his formation had done to his capacity for warmth. He was mission, purely and completely, which was a kind of strength and a kind of deficit simultaneously. The costume that the backup personality manifested in, when the Black Glove's assault on Bruce Wayne's psyche finally activated it, was not the standard suit. It was garish, an improbable purple and red and yellow, a combination of colors that bore no relationship to the design philosophy of stealth and intimidation that had produced Batman's standard appearance. Colors that communicated something closer to deliberate visibility than the shadows that the primary identity was built around. This was not an accident, and it was not a failure of design. It was a functional choice that reflected the specific operational requirements of the backup personality's existence. The standard suit was part of Bruce Wayne's identity in ways that went beyond its operational utility. Its specific design, the darkness, the specific configuration of the emblem, the accumulated symbolic weight of decades of public association with what Batman was and what Batman represented, was inseparable from the Bruce Wayne formation that had produced it. The backup personality could not wear the standard suit without the risk of creating confusion between itself and the primary identity it was designed to replace in circumstances where the primary identity was unavailable. The garish colors were a declaration of difference, a signal that whatever this was, it was not the ordinary Batman, that the circumstances that had produced it were not ordinary circumstances and should not be responded to as if they were. The Batman of Zurinahr carried a weapon, a crude bat, made from materials available in the Gotham streets where the backup personality found itself operating. A blunt instrument that bore no relationship to the sophisticated technology of the standard operational arsenal. This detail was as deliberate as the costume's colors. The backup personality had access to everything Batman's training had installed across decades of physical and intellectual development: the martial arts, the tactical knowledge, the detective capabilities, the comprehensive understanding of human psychology and criminal behavior that made Batman effective in ways that went far beyond mere physical capability. What it did not have was the infrastructure of the cave, and the bat was the backup's acknowledgement of this absence and its declaration of independence from it. Whatever it needed, it would find in the environment where it found itself operating. It would not wait for the conditions that the primary identity's full operational capacity required. The Black Glove's assault that had activated the backup represented perhaps the most sophisticated attack on Bruce Wayne's identity that any adversary had ever attempted. because it targeted the one vulnerability that most adversaries had never identified as a vulnerability at all. His enemies had tried to break him physically. Bane had succeeded, temporarily. They had tried to compromise him emotionally. The Joker had made a sustained career of it, with varying results. They had tried to destroy his resources and his infrastructure and his relationships and his public identity in various combinations and through various mechanisms across decades of conflict. All of these attacks had assumed that the target was Bruce Wayne, that destroying or compromising Bruce Wayne was equivalent to destroying or compromising Batman, that the identity was dependent on the person in the way that most identities were dependent on their persons. Dr. Hurt and the Black Glove had understood something different. They had understood that the identity was psychologically constructed in ways that made its construction vulnerable to psychological deconstruction, that the specific architecture of Bruce Wayne's mind, the carefully organized layering of trauma and mission and constructed persona and suppressed genuine self, could be attacked at the level of its organization rather than at the level of any individual component. They had attempted to fracture the mind rather than break the body, to introduce contradictions and revelations and psychological pressures that would cause the construction to collapse from within. They had succeeded in fracturing Bruce Wayne. They had not accounted for what lived beneath the fracture. The Zurinahr personality operated through the period of Bruce Wayne's psychological compromise with the focused effectiveness of something that did not experience the doubt and the disorientation and the destabilization that the Black Glove had designed its assault to produce, because it had nothing to doubt and nothing to be disoriented about. It was not trying to maintain a complex layered identity under pressure. It was not trying to perform Bruce Wayne while being Batman, while the architecture supporting both was under active assault. It was simply the mission, proceeding through whatever obstacles were in front of it, with the clean, uncomplicated purposefulness of a thing that had been built to survive exactly this circumstance and was now surviving it. The implications of the backup personality's existence were implications that the legend preferred to engage with at the level of clever design, Batman's forward planning, the depth of his preparation, the characteristic thoroughness with which he had anticipated even his own psychological destruction, rather than at the level of what the design actually required and what it revealed about the person who had installed it. What it required was the acceptance that Bruce Wayne's psychological destruction was a realistic enough possibility to warrant specific preparation for surviving it. What it revealed was that Bruce Wayne had looked at the structure of his own mind and had found in it not a foundation of sufficient stability to preclude such preparation, but a construction that he understood was vulnerable, that he knew could be attacked in ways that he could not be certain of defending against, that he had decided to install a backup beneath precisely because he could not guarantee that the primary would survive everything it would face. He had trusted himself to survive almost anything except the specific attack that his specific formation made possible, and he had accordingly prepared for that specific failure with the same thoroughness he brought to every other failure mode he identified in his operational planning. The Batman of Zurinahr was the mask behind the mask, the identity within the identity, the self beneath the self, the thing that remained when everything constructed was stripped away. It was the answer to the question of what Bruce Wayne actually was at the deepest level, the question that no examination of either the Playboy persona or the Batman primary identity quite answered, because both of those were constructions, and constructions by definition did not reach the bottom. At the bottom, apparently, was the mission, pure and simple and stripped of everything else. Not the person who had chosen the mission, not the grief that had motivated the choice, not the love that had made the grief possible, just the mission itself, continuing because stopping was not something it knew how to do. Whether this was the most honest thing about Bruce Wayne or the most frightening was a question that admitted of no comfortable answer, which was perhaps why the legend preferred to discuss the backup's existence as clever design rather than examining what it meant that the design had been necessary. There is a story that exists in the space between what happened and what might have happened, in the particular darkness of the question that survivors of catastrophic loss are never entirely able to stop asking, what if the wrong person survived? The Flashpoint timeline was Barry Allen's mistake and Barry Allen's responsibility, a temporal disruption produced by the decision to prevent his mother's murder that cascaded outward through the architecture of history in ways that altered everything it touched, replacing the world that existed with a darker and more desperate version of itself, in which the changes Barry had made to one specific night had produced consequences he had never anticipated and could not have predicted from the vantage point of the grief that had motivated his intervention. He arrived in the altered timeline to discover that his heroic identity was gone, that the world he had returned to bore the shape of the world he knew without its substance, that the people he recognized were not the people he knew, because the history that had formed them was not the history that had formed his versions of them. He discovered, among the many discoveries the altered timeline required him to make, that Bruce Wayne was dead. Not missing, not operating under a different identity, not displaced to another time or another dimension in the ways that the extraordinary circumstances of extraordinary people sometimes displace them. Dead. Killed in Crime Alley as a child, on a night that had gone differently than the night Barry Allen remembered, when the gun that Joe Chill had pressed against Thomas Wayne's chest had fired at a different moment, and the bullet had found a different target, and the child between his parents had been the one who did not survive the alley, rather than the one who walked out of it, carrying the weight of what he had witnessed into every subsequent year of his life. Thomas Wayne had survived, Martha Wayne had survived, and what the survival had done to each of them was the altered timeline's most complete and most devastating expression of a principle that the primary timeline had demonstrated repeatedly in less concentrated form, that the same loss, processed through different psychologies, produced entirely different responses, and that the responses were not equivalent in their consequences for the people around those who experienced them. Thomas Wayne had become Batman. The Thomas Wayne Batman was recognizable as Batman in the way that a photograph taken in different light is recognizable as a photograph of the same subject, the essential features present, the overall shape correct, the immediate identification available to anyone familiar with the original, but something in the quality of the image fundamentally different from what one was accustomed to seeing. He wore a version of the costume. He operated in Gotham. He pursued the mission of protecting the innocent and confronting the criminal with the commitment of someone for whom the mission was not a calling accepted from outside, but a wound that had taken this particular shape, because this particular shape was the only form in which the wound could be expressed without destroying everything around it. But Thomas Wayne's Batman used lethal force. This was the difference that everything else followed from: the departure from Bruce Wayne's absolute rule that established the specific character of his father's version of the identity before any other detail about it had been provided. He killed, when killing was the most efficient resolution to the threat in front of him, with the directness of someone who had not built an ethical architecture around the refusal to kill, and who therefore did not experience the conflict between efficiency and principle that the refusal created in Bruce's iteration of the same identity. He was not cruel. His killing was not sadistic or excessive or motivated by anything that resembled pleasure in the act itself, but it was present and it was deliberate, and it said something specific about the kind of person Thomas Wayne was and the kind of formation that had produced his particular expression of this particular grief. Bruce Wayne's refusal to kill had been one of the most psychologically revealing features of his identity, revealing not primarily as a moral stance, though it functioned as one, but as evidence of what the formation of his specific identity had done to his relationship with the violence he deployed. He had become something that used fear and physical force as instruments of protection, had become intimate with violence in ways that his daily operational life required, and had maintained across all of it a categorical refusal that preserved a boundary between what he was and what his enemies were, that nothing else about his methods could have preserved. The refusal was the last line, the one concession to the child in the alley who had not yet learned that violence was sometimes necessary, the protection of something that he could not name but could not abandon without losing whatever remained of the person he had been before the cave. Thomas Wayne had no such child to protect. The child was dead. The child's death was the wound that had produced the Batman, who now moved through Flashpoint's Gotham with the efficiency and the brutality of someone who had nothing left to protect by refusing. Nothing that the refusal could preserve that the loss had not already destroyed. He had lost his son. He had watched Martha descend into the particular darkness that the same loss had produced in her through a different mechanism. He had built the identity not to honor a vow made in grief, but to express a grief that had no other outlet. And the expression did not require the same restraints that Bruce's version had installed, because the formation that had produced it was different in ways that went all the way down. Martha Wayne's transformation was the altered timeline's most horrifying detail. The element that made Flashpoint's version of the Wayne tragedy not simply a variation on the original, but a demonstration of the original's most disturbing possible implication. She had become the Joker, not a Joker, not someone who happened to share the primary timeline's Joker's aesthetic and philosophical commitments. She had become the Joker in the specific sense that the role the Joker occupied in Gotham's criminal, psychological ecosystem was occupied in Flashpoint's Gotham by Bruce Wayne's mother, by the woman who in the primary timeline had died in the alley, and whose death had been one half of the catastrophe that made her son what he became. The primary timeline's Joker had been made by a single bad day, had arrived at his philosophy of cosmic absurdity and the meaninglessness of everything through a catastrophic experience that had dissolved his previous relationship to consensus reality and replaced it with the revelation that the dissolution was the truth. Martha Wayne's path to the same destination had required only a different catastrophic experience, not personal humiliation and chemical transformation, but the death of her child and the particular quality of grief that affared. Parents' loss of a child produces when it is allowed to go deep enough and dark enough without anything to anchor it to the possibility of meaning or recovery. The Joker that Martha Wayne became was different from the Joker that the altered timeline's Gotham might otherwise have produced. Different in the specific ways that her particular formation made her different, more personal, more focused on the specific relationships and specific losses that had produced her, rather than on the abstract philosophical argument about meaninglessness that the primary timeline's Joker pursued with the dedication of a genuine intellectual. She knew Thomas. She knew what he had become. The confrontation between Batman and the Joker in Flashpoint's Gotham was a confrontation between two parents who had processed the death of their child in the two most opposite ways available to human psychology, one through the construction of absolute purpose, the other through the demolition of purpose entirely, and the confrontation had the quality of something that was also a conversation, or the ruins of a conversation, between two people who had once shared something and had been separated by catastrophe into irreconcilable versions of themselves. Barry Allen's conversation with Thomas Wayne was one of the most significant exchanges in the altered timeline, not for what it revealed about Thomas specifically, but for what it forced into explicit articulation about the Batman, identity, and what that identity was actually for. Barry came to Thomas because he needed help, because the altered timeline's version of the extraordinary person who occupied Bruce Wayne's role in the primary timeline was Thomas Wayne, and Thomas Wayne's help was therefore what the situation required. But he came also carrying knowledge that Thomas did not possess knowledge of the primary timeline, of the night in Crime Alley as it had actually happened, of the child who had survived, and the parents who had died, and what the surviving child had made of his survival. Thomas Wayne received this knowledge with the specific difficulty of someone being told something they cannot verify and cannot quite disbelieve, something that reorganizes the meaning of everything they have understood their life to be about, without providing any framework for what the reorganization requires them to do differently. He had built his identity around the death of his son. He was being told that in the world that should exist, it was he and Martha who had died, and the son had lived, and the son had built something from the survival that the father could recognize as continuous with what he had built from the different version of the same night. The recognition was not comfortable, and it was not resolved into anything that simplified the situation, but it was genuine, a father understanding, from an impossible vantage point, something about the son he had never known. The letter that Thomas Wayne sent across the fractured timeline to Bruce, written with the understanding that if Barry succeeded in restoring the primary timeline, the letter would somehow reach its destination. That the father, who had never known his son, might leave something for the son who had never known his father, was the most human moment in the entire Flashpoint arc. The moment when the extraordinary circumstances were set aside long enough for the ordinary grief beneath them to be visible. Thomas Wayne was a man who had lost his child and had built a Batman from the loss. He was writing to the child, now an adult, who had built a Batman from the same loss approached from the other side. He did not know Bruce. He had never known Bruce. But he knew the loss, and the loss was the foundation of everything Bruce had become. And writing from that foundation to the person who had built from the same foundation, something that Thomas could now see as the better version of what both of them had attempted, was an act of love across an impossibility. Bruce Wayne wept when he read the letter, which was among the very small number of recorded instances of Bruce Wayne weeping at all, and the rarity of the instance was itself a measure of the letter's significance. The father he had lost in the alley, whose death had been the first cause of everything that followed, had somehow reached him from the other side of a catastrophe that should have made all reaching impossible, and had told him something that he had needed to hear for longer than the telling could have been anticipated. What Thomas Wayne's Batman revealed about the identity was what the identity looked like when the formation was different in the most fundamental possible way, when grief arrived from the direction of a parent rather than a child, when the person who built from the loss had lived more life before the loss and had different resources and different deficits and a different relationship to the possibility of meaning that might survive it. The identity was recognizable. The commitment was genuine. The willingness to sacrifice everything in service of the mission was identical, but the specific shape that grief had given this particular expression of the identity was different, and the difference was legible in the one rule Bruce kept, and Thomas did not, the rule that was, finally, the last thing Bruce Wayne preserved of the child who had stood between his parents in the alley and had not yet learned what the world required of the people it broke most completely. There is a version of the Batman identity that exists so far from its origin point that the origin point can barely be perceived from within it, the way a star appears as a fixed point of light, rather than the enormous churning thing it actually is, when the distance between the observer and the observed has grown large enough. Terry McGinness was that distance made human. The Gotham he was born into was not the Gotham that Bruce Wayne had inherited from his parents' deaths, and spent his life attempting to protect and correct and redeem through methods that the city had absorbed and adapted to across decades of their deployment. It was the Gotham that those decades had produced, shaped by everything Bruce Wayne had done and everything he had failed to do, bearing the marks of the war he had conducted and the institutions he had built and the enemies he had defeated and the enemies he had not defeated, a city that had moved through time in the way that cities do, carrying its history forward into a present that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had known only its past. The specific texture of its corruption and its beauty had changed. The specific forms that its dangers took had evolved. The people who moved through it carried histories that had no equivalent in the Gotham, where the grandfather clock concealed a passage down into a cave that was also the truest home of the last of the Waynes. The technology had changed most visibly and most dramatically, in the way that technology always changes most visibly and most dramatically across sufficient spans of time, becoming the most immediate marker of historical distance in a world where human nature's fundamental constants ensured that everything else changed more slowly. The Gotham of 2050 and beyond was a city of advanced biotechnology and ubiquitous corporate power, and the specific social tensions that emerge when the distance between what technology makes possible and what ordinary people can access is large enough and persistent enough to become structural rather than incidental. It was a city that Bruce Wayne would have recognized in its essentials and found alien in almost every specific, a place organized around the same basic human arrangements of power and vulnerability that Gotham had always been organized around, expressed through forms that would have required considerable study to fully comprehend. Bruce Wayne was old. This is stated as a fact rather than a judgment, because it was a fact rather than a judgment, a simple description of the condition that time had produced in the body that had spent decades being used in ways that even the most extraordinary physical specimen could not sustain, without accumulating damage that eventually became permanent rather than temporary. He had aged as damaged people age more quickly and less gracefully than the undamaged, his body reflecting in its specific deteriorations the specific history of what had been done to it and what he had required it to endure across the years of the war. He could not wear the suit. He could not be Batman in the physical sense that Batman's operations had always required, could not conduct the nightly work of Gotham's protection through the direct personal engagement that had been the identity's primary mode for as long as he had inhabited it. He had retreated to the manor rebuilt, reconfigured, but still the manor, still the building on the ridge above the city that the Wayne family's history had planted there, and that subsequent generations had maintained as the most visible evidence of the family's continued relationship with the city. Below, he lived there with the quality of someone who had outlasted their own era, who continued to exist in a time that had moved past the specific circumstances that had made their existence what it was, surrounded by the evidence of what they had been in a form that continued, rather than having reached any resolution that justified the word ended. The cave remained beneath the manor, and the cave still held its contents, and among its contents was the suit updated, advanced, rebuilt across the years of Bruce's continued engagement with the problem of Gotham's protection, even as his body became less capable of wearing it. The technology of the suit progressing in parallel with the technology of the city above, in ways that the cave's resources and Bruce's ongoing intelligence made possible. The suit that the cave held in the year Terry McGinness discovered, it was not the suit that Bruce Wayne had first designed and worn in the early years of the identity. It was everything that 5 decades of continuous development had produced, the accumulated result of every lesson learned and every failure analyzed and every technological advance incorporated and every operational requirement addressed across a period of development that had no equivalent in the history of any other piece of equipment that had ever been brought to bear on the problem of protecting a city. Terry McGinness found the cave, the way that finding the cave required not through invitation, not through disclosure, but through the specific combination of circumstances and character that had produced the discovery of each previous person who had learned the truth beneath the manor. He was 17. He was in trouble of the kind that Gotham produced for young people, whose instincts toward defiance were stronger than their resources for managing its consequences. His father had been murdered, the murder connected to the corporate criminality that in the Gotham of Terry's era was the primary expression of the same impulse toward predation that had organized crime in Bruce Wayne's era, and the murder had done to Terry what the murder in Crime Alley had done to a different young person in a different decade, had installed in him an orientation toward justice that was personal enough and urgent enough to override the frienda caution that self-preservation normally provided. The old man in the manor had helped him the first time, because the old man still responded to the presence of genuine threat with the instincts of someone for whom response to genuine threat was the most fundamental organizing principle of a very long life, and because something in Terry's situation had activated those instincts in ways that Bruce Wayne's accumulated guardedness had not entirely suppressed. The help had been limited and reluctant, and accompanied by the specific quality of emotional distance that Bruce Wayne had always maintained, with everyone he allowed into any degree of proximity, but it had been real, and Terry had recognized it as real, and the recognition had been the beginning of something that neither of them had planned. When Terry subsequently took the suit without permission and used it to pursue the justice his father's death required, the act was transgression in the technical sense, and something else in the sense that mattered more. He had understood, from his limited exposure to the old man and the cave, what the suit was for, not the operational specifics, not the decades of developed capability that the technology represented, but the essential purpose that the suit had always served, and that its advanced technology served no less in his hands than it had in its designers. He used it badly, and he used it imperfectly, and he used it with the specific recklessness of someone whose training was entirely insufficient for the circumstances he was deploying himself into, and he used it for the right reason, which was the reason that had always been at the center of the identity. Despite everything else, the identity had accumulated around that center across decades of increasingly complex operation. Bruce Wayne did not forgive the transgression so much as he recognized in it something that made forgiveness beside the point. The mentorship that developed between them was unlike any previous relationship the cave had housed, because it was organized around a fundamental asymmetry that was different in kind from the asymmetries that had characterized Bruce's relationships with his previous partners and protégés. Dick and Jason and Tim and Barbara had all come to the cave as young people whose formation was still largely available for influence, whose potential trajectories were still substantially open, who were being shaped by the cave's methods and the cave's occupant in ways that produced the specific capabilities and the specific damage that the cave's influence reliably produced. Bruce had been, in each of these relationships, the person in the field as well as the person providing guidance, the one whose operational example was as much a part of the transmission as the explicit instruction. With Terry, Bruce was only in the chair. He was the voice in the earpiece and the intelligence at the keyboard and the accumulated knowledge of 5 decades of operating against Gotham's criminal ecosystem, offered as guidance to someone who was physically present in the city while he was physically absent from it. The relationship inverted the usual architecture of mentorship in ways that the old man found genuinely difficult, not the giving of knowledge, which he had always done, but the relinquishing of control that the giving required when he was not present to override what the knowledge produced if what it produced was wrong. Terry was not Bruce Wayne. This was the most obvious fact about the arrangement and also its most significant. He did not share Bruce's formation. He had not built his engagement with the mission from the specific grief of standing between murdered parents in an alley and surviving. He had his own grief and his own anger and his own specific reasons for the commitment he was making, and those reasons were real, and they were sufficient, and they were his, which meant they were different from Bruce's in ways that expressed themselves continuously in how Terry operated and what decisions he made and which aspects of the identity he inhabited naturally and which he struggled with and which he approached from angles that Bruce's decades of operation had never produced. The suit's advanced capabilities gave Terry abilities that Bruce had never possessed, even at the peak of his physical career. And this fact redistributed the equation between natural talent and technological augmentation in ways that produced a different kind of Batman than the kind Bruce had been. Bruce had been extraordinary because he was extraordinary, because the decades of deliberate self-development had produced genuine human capability that exceeded what anyone who had not made the same sacrifices could replicate. Terry was extraordinary because the suit was extraordinary, and the distinction was one that Bruce found both practically irrelevant and personally significant, in a way he was characteristically unwilling to examine directly. The revelation in the comics continuity that Terry McGinness was biologically Bruce Wayne's son, that a government genetic program had replaced Warren McGinness's DNA with Bruce Wayne's without any consent or knowledge, that the child who had discovered the cave and taken the suit and been reluctantly accepted as its next occupant was, in the most literal possible sense. The son that Bruce Wayne had never had and had never known reframed the entire relationship in ways that neither of them had possessed the information to understand while the relationship was developing. It also raised questions about the program, about the governmental willingness to conduct genetic interventions on private citizens without their knowledge, about the specific decision to ensure that the Batman legacy would have a biological heir, regardless of the choices of the person whose legacy it was. That the story declined to fully answer, but was willing to fully ask. The reframing did not change what Terry and Bruce had built together, but it changed the context in which that building had occurred, and context changes meaning, even when it leaves the facts unchanged. Bruce Wayne, who had organized his entire existence around the mission, at the cost of the ordinary human life that the mission foreclosed, had nonetheless produced a son, had been made to produce a son, through mechanisms he had not chosen and had not known about, and the son had found his way to the cave by routes that had nothing to do with the intervention that had produced him, and everything to do with who he actually was. What Terry McGinness represented in the long history of the Batman identity was the question of what the identity became when it traveled far enough from its origin that the origin was no longer the organizing context for its meaning. Bruce Wayne's Batman had been organized around Bruce Wayne's grief, the specific personal history that had produced the specific commitment that had produced the specific identity. Every previous successor had stood close enough to that origin that it remained legible as the foundation of what they were carrying. Dick had known Bruce, had been formed by him, carried the relationship with the origin as part of his own history. Even Terry had known Bruce, had been shaped by him, bore the marks of his influence in the specific ways that the mentorship had produced. But the Gotham that Terry would eventually protect after Bruce Wayne was fully gone would not be a Gotham that remembered Bruce Wayne's grief as a living thing. It would be a Gotham that knew Batman as a symbol old, established, belonging to a history that was genuinely historical rather than recent, and that received Terry's inhabitation of that symbol as a continuation rather than an origin. The origin would be legend. The legend would be what the symbol meant. The cave waited for this future with the patience of old stone, and the suit waited in it. And the name that the suit carried forward into times its creator could not have imagined waited with them both. There is a moment in the history of any idea when its originator decides that the idea is larger than the person who originated it, that its survival and propagation require more than one person's capacity to embody it, that the choice between keeping it personal and making it permanent must be made, and that permanence requires distribution. Bruce Wayne made this decision publicly, which was itself the most radical element of it, more radical than the decision to expand, more radical than the specific form the expansion took, more radical even than the acknowledgement that the Batman identity had always been funded by Wayne resources and therefore bore a relationship to Wayne Enterprises that the mythology of the solitary guardian had always obscured. He stood before the world as Bruce Wayne and announced that Batman was a concept he was franchising, that Wayne Enterprises would fund the extension of the Batman methodology to cities and regions beyond Gotham, that the symbol would be worn by people whose specific identities remained their own, while the mission they served and the resources supporting it became shared across a global network of operationally connected individuals. The announcement was extraordinary for what it did not do as much as for what it did. It did not reveal Bruce Wayne as Batman. It reframed the relationship between Bruce Wayne and Batman in a way that made the question of Bruce Wayne's personal identity as Batman simultaneously more plausible and less operationally significant if Batman was a concept that Wayne Enterprises sponsored and that could be inhabited by multiple people simultaneously. Then Bruce Wayne's particular relationship to the concept became one data point among many, rather than the secret whose exposure would end everything. The announcement was its own form of concealment, using transparency about the institutional relationship to provide new cover for the personal one. Batman Incorporated was the name the initiative took, and the name was as deliberate as everything else about the project. Incorporated carried the double meaning that Bruce Wayne's public framing exploited the business sense of the term, which was the surface, and the older sense of incorporation as the act of giving body to something that had previously been formless, of making concrete and physical what had existed as idea or principle or aspiration. Batman was being incorporated in both senses, simultaneously given the corporate structure that would fund and organize its expansion, and given the multiple bodies that the expansion required to be present in multiple places at once. The members of Batman Incorporated were recruited from the existing landscape of heroes operating in various regions of the world, people who had already committed themselves to the protection of their respective communities through methods and motivations that had developed independently of Bruce Wayne's particular formation, but that shared enough of the essential orientation to make the alignment coherent rather than merely convenient. Knight and Squire in England brought the specific texture of British heroic tradition to the network, their dynamic reflecting the class and historical dimensions of their particular context in ways that were recognizably Batman adjacent, while being irreducibly their own. Night Runner in France brought the specific perspective of someone operating in a city whose particular social tensions shaped the mission in ways that Gotham's specific tensions had shaped Bruce Wayne's. Dark Ranger in Australia, Batwing in Africa, El Gaucho in Argentina, each brought the specific context of their specific place, the particular form that the need for protection took in communities whose histories and circumstances produced different configurations of vulnerability and threat than the ones Gotham's specific pathology produced. The tactical advantages of the distributed network were the advantages that any distributed system possessed over any centralized one, when the problem being addressed was geographically dispersed and temporally unpredictable. More simultaneous coverage meant that threats in multiple locations could be addressed without the triage that a single operative's finite presence always required. More intelligence networks meant that information about globally connected criminal organizations, the kind of criminal enterprise that the 21st century's interconnected world made possible, and that Gotham-based operations had always been poorly positioned to address comprehensively, could be gathered and shared across the network in ways that single city operations could never match. The sum of the network's capabilities exceeded what any individual member could provide, and the excess was not trivial. But distribution created vulnerabilities that centralization had never faced, and the vulnerabilities were not simply operational but philosophical, touching the deepest questions about what the Batman identity actually was, and whether it could survive the kind of distribution that Batman Incorporated required. Each member of the network was a potential target in ways that went beyond the ordinary dangers of heroic operation. They were targets, not simply as individuals whose defeat would remove their capabilities from the field, but as nodes whose compromise would damage the network's integrity, and as symbols whose public failures would damage the symbol that all of them collectively embodied. The Batman identity had survived Bruce Wayne's physical defeats and psychological crises and periods of absence because the symbol's association with a single individual who controlled the narrative of his own failures meant that failures could be managed, contextualized, absorbed into the ongoing story of the identity without threatening the symbol's fundamental meaning. Batman Incorporated's distribution of the symbol across multiple individuals meant that any one of those individuals' failures was immediately a failure of the symbol itself, visible and public, and not subject to the same narrative management that Bruce Wayne's control over his own story had always permitted. Leviathan understood this with the strategic sophistication that characterized its operations throughout its war against Batman Incorporated, approaching the network as a distributed target rather than a centralized one, identifying the nodes whose elimination or compromise would produce maximum damage to the network's operational capacity and symbolic integrity, and pursuing their elimination with the systematic thoroughness that a well-resourced and intelligently directed organization could bring to a problem it had correctly identified and correctly understood. The war between Batman Incorporated and Leviathan was not simply a conflict between opposed capabilities, but a conflict between opposed organizational philosophies. The distributed network, designed for resilience and reach, against the centralized command designed for focus and penetration, each exploiting the other's characteristic vulnerabilities while attempting to protect its own. Damian Wayne's death during this conflict was the price that Batman Incorporated paid in its most personal and most irreversible form. He died not because of any failure in his individual capability or commitment, but because he was a node in a network that a sophisticated adversary had targeted with sufficient resources and sufficient understanding to make the targeting effective. Because the distribution that made the network strong had also made each of its members individually exposed in ways that Bruce Wayne's solitary operation had never exposed anyone but Bruce Wayne himself. The specific grief of losing a child, the grief that had made Thomas Wayne what he became in the altered timeline, the grief that stood at the limit of what even the most psychologically fortified person could be asked to endure, arrived in Bruce Wayne's life through the network he had built, through the expansion of the identity he had created, through the decision to make Batman larger than one person, in ways that made more people subject to the costs that the identity had always extracted from everyone who inhabited it. The question Batman Incorporated raised that no previous form of the identity had raised in the same terms was the question of responsibility, of what a person owed to the people they recruited into their mission, of whether the expansion of a mission across multiple willing participants absolved the mission's originator of the specific obligations that direct recruitment created, of whether the institutional form of the identity changed the moral character of the identity's relationship to the people who embodied it. Bruce Wayne had always been responsible, in the personal and direct sense, for the well-being of the people he had personally brought into the cave. Batman Incorporated created a relationship between the identity's originator and its distributed embodiments that was less direct, more institutional, mediated by the organizational structures of a global network in ways that obscured the lines of personal responsibility without eliminating the underlying moral facts. The symbol remained after everything. After the war with Leviathan and the loss of Damian and the dissolution of the formal incorporated structure, the symbol persisted in the way that symbols persist when they have been sufficiently distributed, not dependent on any single person's continued inhabitation of them, not vulnerable to any single person's destruction or defeat or decision to step away, present in the world in ways that did not require active maintenance, because the distribution had made the symbol's continued existence a property of the cultural landscape rather than of any individual effort. This was what Bruce Wayne had intended. It was also the most complete expression of what the identity had always been moving toward, the progressive detachment of the symbol from the specific wound that had created it, the gradual independence of the idea from the person whose grief had first given it form. What the complete history of every identity Bruce Wayne has worn reveals, when examined from the vantage point of its full accumulated length, is something that no individual chapter of that history quite reveals on its own, something visible only in the pattern, in the shape that all the chapters together describe when they are held simultaneously in view. The pattern is this, that every mask leaves marks on the face beneath it. Bruce Wayne, the playboy, had required the suppression of genuine human connection across decades of sustained performance, and the suppression had produced in the genuine person beneath the performance a specific kind of loneliness that was different from ordinary loneliness, because it was structural rather than circumstantial, not the loneliness of someone who had not yet found their people, but the loneliness of someone who had arranged their existence so that finding their people was operationally inadvisable. The marks the Bruce Wayne mask left were the marks of performed vacancy, of a face held in expressions that did not correspond to anything real for long enough that the performed expressions and the genuine ones became difficult even for their wearer to reliably distinguish. Matches Malone had required the adoption of a criminal orientation, convincingly enough to deceive actual criminals, and the adoption had required something that pure performance could not account for, a genuine understanding of how criminal thinking worked, developed through proximity close enough and sustained enough to produce comprehension rather than mere imitation. The marks the Matches mask left were the marks of that comprehension, the specific fluency with criminal logic that distinguished a performance from an understanding, and that could not be entirely set aside when the performance concluded, because understanding does not evaporate when the circumstances that produced it change. The Batman of Zurinahr had required Bruce Wayne to accept his own psychological destruction as a realistic enough possibility to specifically prepare for surviving it. And the preparation had required the construction of an internal architecture whose existence was itself evidence of a specific form of self-knowledge. The knowledge that the construction one had built could be attacked at the farther level of its organization, that the self was not a fixed thing, but a structure whose structural integrity could not be guaranteed. The marks the Zurinahr mask left were the marks of that knowledge, the specific quality of vigilance about one's own psychological foundations that a person carries differently once they have understood that those foundations require active maintenance rather than passive reliance. Jean-Paul Valley had revealed what the tools of the identity produced when separated from the values the identity was built to serve. And the revelation had required Bruce Wayne to confront the fact that what he had built could be given to someone else and used as a weapon by that someone else in ways that he had not sufficiently protected against. The marks that observing Jean-Paul's failure left were the marks of that confrontation, the specific humility about the identity's independence from its creator that the Nightfall arc forced into acknowledgement. Dick Grayson's Batman had revealed that the identity could be inhabited differently and sometimes better, that the specific psychology of its creator was not the only psychology capable of serving its values, that warmth could accomplish what grimness could not, and that the cave's methods were not the only methods available to someone genuinely committed to the mission's actual purposes, rather than its established forms. The marks that Dick's iteration left on Bruce Wayne's understanding of what he had built were the marks of that revelation, the difficult recognition that someone else had carried his identity and had carried it well, had in certain respects carried it better, and that this was not a diminishment, but an expansion of what the identity was capable of being. Thomas Wayne's Batman had held up the mirror that the altered timeline constructed, showing Bruce Wayne what the same wound looked like when processed by a different person, what the same loss produced when it arrived from the direction of a parent rather than a child, how the identity that grief had built through his specific formation would have been different if his specific formation had been different. The marks that the mirror left were the marks of seeing oneself reflected in a version of oneself that made visible what one's own version concealed, the specific choices that felt inevitable from inside the formation that had produced them, but that were revealed as choices when a different formation produced different ones. Terry McGinness had carried the identity forward into a time and a place where the origin was history, where the grief at the center of the identity's meaning was so remote from the present that it required active study to understand, rather than active suppression to survive, and had shown that the identity could outlive not just its creator, but the specific cultural and historical conditions that had made its creation comprehensible. The marks that Terry's existence left were the marks of a founder seeing their foundation survive beyond the circumstances of its founding, seeing the thing they built become independent of the building. And Batman Incorporated had distributed the identity across enough faces and enough bodies and enough specific contexts that the question of which face beneath the masks was the real one became, finally, the question it had always been: Not a question about Bruce Wayne specifically, but a question about identity in general, about what the relationship between the person and the persona actually was, when the persona had been inhabited long enough and seriously enough, and at sufficient cost to become indistinguishable from the person in every way that the person, outside world, could observe. We all wear masks. This is not a metaphor that requires an extraordinary life to make legible. It is a description of the ordinary human arrangement, whereby the self we present to different audiences and in different contexts is shaped by what those consecuted audiences and contexts require, what they can receive, what we judge it safe or appropriate or necessary to offer them. The masks are not all lies. Some of them are protections. Some of them are kindnesses. Some of them are the specific form that love takes when love requires the concealment of its own anxieties to avoid burdening the people it is directed toward. But every mask leaves marks. The face beneath is shaped by the sustained pressure of what it wears over it, changed by the years of expression that the mask required, and the years of expression that the mask prevented, bearing in its specific configurations the evidence of everything it has held and hidden and maintained and performed. The face beneath Bruce Wayne's masks, beneath the playboy, beneath the criminal, beneath the cowl itself, was not the face of the child in the alley. It was the face that all those years of wearing had produced, marked and shaped and permanently altered by the sustained pressure of a life lived in service of identities that each extracted their specific price for the specific function they served. The question of which face was real had never had a clean answer. What was real was all of it: the performance and the performer, the mask and the mark, the constructed identity and the person the construction had made out of the person it had started with. Every face the darkness wore was true in its own way, and every one of them was the face of a man who had stood in an alley as a child and had decided, in the only way available to him, that the darkness would not have the last word. And so ends our long walk through the faces behind the cowl, not with resolution, because the question of which face was real was never the kind of question that resolves, but with something quieter and more honest than resolution. Rest now, fellow keeper of Gotham's secrets. Let the cave's darkness settle around you the way darkness settles when it is familiar rather than threatening, when it is the darkness of a place that has been tended and known rather than the darkness of a place that conceals something waiting to cause harm. Let the grandfather clock stand at its threshold between the ordinary and the extraordinary and ask nothing of you tonight. We are all of us more than one person. We all present different faces to different rooms, protect certain truths behind certain performances, carry somewhere beneath the constructed self a quieter and more vulnerable person who existed before the constructions became necessary. This is not dishonesty, it is the ordinary human arrangement, practiced by everyone who has ever loved something enough to protect it. The cowl rests in the cave, patient, neither Bruce Wayne's nor anyone else's tonight, simply the symbol, keeping its watch in the dark so that you need not keep yours. Sleep now. You are seen, you are safe.